This is travel tracker training for transportation administrators for setting up funding sources and account codes or budget codes. Districts can use the funding sources setup table to indicate which funding areas and budget codes will be used to pay for a trip. The funding source will also indicate if a funding approver will need to approve the trip and who is responsible for paying invoices from the funding source. Funding sources can be configured in a variety of ways and can be site-specific and or apply to only certain types of trips. We give you a tremendous amount of flexibility on the funding sources. You can create as many funding sources as you need. When a user creates a trip request, they can select a funding source. You can also indicate if funding sources are required on a trip request and at what point a budget code is required. To begin, we need to turn on the use of the funding sources and determine when the funding source needs to be selected. There are setup options in the other setup decisions that affect the funding source and the budget code selections. Click on the Configuration tab and then click on Other Setup Decisions. Find the Funding Decisions topic and click on it to expand it. This section will allow you to determine if funding sources and budget codes are required on trip request, and if so, at what level the budget code will need to be selected. The first question asks if you want to show the funding selections for the requesters. Do the trip requesters know the funding source that will pay for their trip, or will that be determined at a later point in the approval process? If your funding sources are known to the end user, the requester, then set this to yes. If not, set it to no. And the funding section will not display on the request form, but will display later for an approver. The next three options will let you determine if a funding source is required to be selected on certain trip types. If a funding source is required for field trips or athletic trips or staff trips, you will indicate that by clicking on yes beside the certain trip types. If they are not required to be selected, you can select no. The next three options will allow you to indicate if a budget code is required, and if so, at what level it must be entered. For example, if you select yes, that a budget code is required for field trips, then the end user would not have to put in the budget code, but an approver would. Let's click yes. And notice that the budget code is required for the first level approver, the second level approver, or the funding approver. So you can choose one of those levels to be required to enter the budget code before they can approve it. The next question asked if you want to require budget codes on funding sources to be listed in the budget code table. The budget code table we will look at later, but what will happen if you say yes here is that they will not be allowed to type in the budget code, avoiding perhaps a mistype in the funding source, and it will auto-populate with an account code or budget code from the table. The next question asks if you want to show a message when an allotment is depleted on a funding source. If you are using allotment-based funding and are providing allotment balances in your funding sources, then you may want to turn this on. If the allotment reaches a level that will put the funding source into a negative amount, then your message will populate on the request form for the requester or whoever is choosing that particular funding source, asking them to perhaps pick a different funding source or just letting them know that the allotment may be depleted. Your message is completely customizable. The last two questions will allow you to make some decisions about the funding sources and who can select funding sources. The first one says to allow two funding sources on trips. If you have situations that your trip cost is being shared by multiple funding, you can share the cost of a trip between two funding sources if you turn this setting to on. Allow admins to select any funding source on a trip, regardless of the funding source being location specific. If you turn this setting to yes, then only admins, transportation admins, will have the authority to choose any funding source from the drop-down in the request form, even if the account code does not contain the location code in the account. So it gives full authority and full range for admins to select any funding source, even if it is not specific to that particular school. Once you have selected your settings, be sure you click the Save button. To create a new funding source, click on the Setup Tables tab, and then click on the Funding Sources on the left-hand margin. Click on Create a New Funding Source. This will open up the funding source table. Let's talk about some of the different fields in the funding source table. First of all, the funding source. The funding source is the name of the funding source. This can be anything that you would like, but it has to be unique. This name will appear in the drop-down list for the funding sources on the trip request form. Examples would be Title I, CTE, school funded. It's important that the name or the title of the funding source is unique, especially if you are using account codes or budget codes. The approver email is an email address of the person who will be approving the trip request when this funding source is used on the trip request. You do not have to include an approver email. If an approver email is not listed, trips with this funding source will not require an additional funding approver. For example, a Title I funding source may need to include the Title I director in the approval process for trips using Title I funds. However, school funded may not need an additional funding approver listed since the principal is probably already approving the trip. Payment email. The payment email is the email of the person who is responsible for payment of the invoices for this funding source. In some cases, this could be the assistant of the director. This person, along with the approver, will receive a weekly reminder if there are approved invoices that are outstanding. You don't need to put a payment email address in this field if the school bookkeeper or school secretary is responsible for paying for the trip request, even if it's using a particular funding source. Notification of use. The notification of use is optional, but can be used to notify someone when trips are requested from this funding source, but they don't want to or need to be in the approval loop. Description. The description will appear on the trip request form after the user selects this funding source. You can use this area to clarify the purpose of this funding source or to provide additional information to the user when they select this funding source. Include on school finance, yes or no. The include on school finance will indicate if invoices from this funding source are shown in the school finance tab that the bookkeepers use. If the bookkeeper is responsible for payment of the invoices from this funding source, you should indicate yes here. If a director or a department is responsible for paying invoices from this funding source, you should indicate no. Location specific. Location specific indicates if this funding source is tied to a particular requesting location. This is great to use if you set up specific funding sources for each school that only apply to that school. If you select yes, you will need to select the location that this funding source applies to. Click on the checkbox beside the schools that this funding source would apply to. Only trip requests from these requesting locations will see this funding source. Display on these trips. Each funding source can also be tied to specific trip types. This can also help reduce the number of funding sources that a person sees on a trip request and help them select the correct one. For example, if you have codes for athletic trips that would not be used on field trips, it would be a good idea to restrict that funding source to just athletic trips. So you would check the box beside athletic. And this funding source would only show up if the trip type was an athletic trip type. Status. The status indicates if a funding source is active. Only active funding sources will display in the funding source dropdown on a trip request. Now let's scroll back up to the top of the table and talk about the 4 options that you have here for setting up each funding source. Option 1 is called Single Budget Code based on the requester's location or department. If you select the single budget code based on the requester's location or department, you are going to have the option to have a budget code that is the same for each location except the location number in the account code. So for example, if the district athletic budget code is a particular string or thread of numbers, except for 3 digits that are the location numbers, you might want to use this option. For example, if we made this a special athletic code, and we wanted to include the account code, we would select the account that all the schools use, with the exception of the location number. So for example, if all schools' athletic trips are paid out of 000308 and then their location number, you see there are little question marks here. So if we selected that, then every time the athletic fund was selected, this would be the account code and the system would automatically add the school's location code in instead of the question marks. Now we'll talk in a few minutes about how and where do these account codes or budget codes come from, and we'll talk about how we set them up. So this first option, a single budget code based on the requester's location or department number, is used to set up when all schools use the same account code except for their location number. The next option is called Single Budget Code Allotments Allowed. This option allows for a single budget code from the budget code table to be selected. You can also leave the budget code blank, but the user will not be allowed to fill in a budget code if they try to enter that in on the trip request. If the user selects this funding source, the budget code will be filled in automatically on the trip form if there is a budget code associated with it. It will not be editable by the user. The question marks that we talked about earlier cannot be used with this option. You have to choose the first option if you want to use the question marks. So if we were using this code, we would see only account codes that don't contain question marks, or you can leave it blank and it will just include the name of the funding source in your request. This option also allows for allotments. This means you can enter a budgeted amount, the allotment, for trips under the funding code, and you will be able to tell on any invoice what the outstanding amounts are for trips using this funding source. If you use this for your schools, we would recommend a funding source for each school with their particular account code listed. Be sure to include beginning and ending dates that apply to the allotment. This is normally your fiscal year. Let's look at that. If you're going to use allotments, be sure you select yes on the allotment used, and then scroll down to the bottom of the table where you see budgeting. This is where you will fill in the information for that particular allotted funding source. So if we were setting up this funding source for the coming school year, we would fill in our beginning and end dates, possibly the school year, the fiscal year, the budget allotment, perhaps $5,000. And then once you have everything filled in, you would click your submit button, and this particular funding source would be available at the date during the dates that were indicated on the funding source, and then for this particular allotted amount. And then as this funding source is used to pay for certain trips, you will begin to see that balance decreasing over the course of using the money. Let's look at an example of a funding table in use that uses an allotment. The actual amounts that are used in calculating the allotment are the invoices approved for payment. Here you can see in our example, there aren't any invoices approved for payment. We see a $0 amount. But if there were invoices that had been approved for payment and we're using this particular funding source, you would see that amount. Invoices marked payment sent. This amount includes invoices that have been marked as payment sent within the allotment date range. These are actual amounts and are therefore subtracted from the allotment. In our example, of course, we see $0 again. Invoices paid. This amount includes any invoices that have been marked paid using the funding source within the allotment date range. These are actual amounts and are therefore subtracted from the allotment balance. And we can see $1,210 from paid invoices. So our balance is calculated from the original allotment, which was $15,000 in our example, and then we would subtract the invoices that were approved for payment, and we would subtract the invoices that had been marked payment sent, and also subtract the invoices marked paid. So we have in our example here $15,000 is the allotment. We don't subtract anything for approved for payment or payment sent, but we subtract $1,210 for a balance of $13,790. Now, we also have some estimated amounts that you can use to come up with an estimated balance of your allotment. The invoices pending estimated amount. This amount includes assignments, invoices that are in a pending status within the allotment date range, and they may not have actual numbers in them yet. So this dollar amount is based on the current invoice amount. It excludes the estimated driver cost. This will include estimated mileage cost if the actual costs have not yet been entered. If the actual driver times have been entered, then it will be included in your pending invoices. Now, the estimated driver cost on pending invoices is only the estimated driver cost for the pending assignments that don't have the actual driver cost. Only funding sources that use allotments will calculate estimated driver cost. It's necessary to more accurately reflect the allotment balance and is computed using the estimated number of hours on the trip and the standard hourly driver rate in the configuration. Once actual driver hours have been entered, the estimated driver cost is removed from this total. Trips without reservations. This amount includes trips that use the allotment funding source within the allotment date range, but no assignments have been made yet, and the dollar amount is only based on the trip estimate. Once the assignment has been made for the trip will no longer be included in this amount, but in the estimated assignment amount. The invoice is pending. So in our example here, we can see that after our actual paid invoices amount has been subtracted from the allotment balance of $15,000, and we have a total balance of $13,790, we have over $22,000 in invoices pending against that. And we have $20,000, over $20,000 of trips that are saying they're using this money and don't have assignments yet, which actually puts us in the hole for this particular funding source over $28,000. So that might be a bit of an extreme example there, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how the allotments work and how your actual balance and the estimated balances are calculated. Option 3, multiple codes based on requester's location or department. This option allows for you to have a funding source that has multiple budget codes based on the user's location code. So for example, if you want to have a funding source that says district-wide budget codes and includes a list of potential budget codes for that user to select from based on their location, this is the setting to use. The budget codes that will appear to the user will be any budget code from your budget code setup table that either has the question marks in it that we looked at earlier or has the actual school code in that account code that matches. The requester who is selecting this, or the approver perhaps, is accustomed to looking at numbers when they are talking about what account is paying for the trip. They don't consider the title of the funding source, Title I, EC, PTO. They don't look at titles, they look at numbers. And so what this option is going to give them is one funding source in the request form, but multiple budget codes that they are allowed to use because their account or their location code is included in the account, or there are question marks in the account that will populate their location code when they select it. To use this option, the budget codes must be listed in the budget code setup table, and they must have either the question marks or the actual school location code in the account. Before you use this option, you do need to set up your budget code structure, and we will help you with that. Contact the support desk or your implementation specialist, and that will indicate which part of the account code is the location code. So you may need more help if you want to set up using this option. And finally, the fourth option, editable blank budget code on a trip request. This option provides a free-form budget code. It can be left blank on the funding source, or can be and can include a budget code or wording. When the user selects this funding source, the budget code can be edited on the trip request if you select that. If you would like for the funding approver to enter their budget code when the trip gets to them, you can leave it blank and allow them to type it in. We have districts who use this and put things like paid by transportation or paid by district in the budget code field. This indicates that the user doesn't have to worry about a specific budget code in this case. So when we fill this one in, and this is probably the most common because it is just a one-to-one relationship, the funding source, and an account code. So if you would fill in the budget code here, and then you can indicate, is that account code editable on the trip request? You would put no if you're going to be putting in your account code. It will just auto-populate with that code. But if you would like to leave this blank and make that account code editable, then the budget code field on the request form, they could type in any string of numbers or words, whatever you would want them to do. So all four options would be completed, would be selected, and your different fields, your approver, payment email notification, description, including on school finance, making the funding source location specific, and displaying on which trips. You would fill in those as required. The display on trips, of course, is required. If it is location specific, yes, you do have to pick a location so that it will show. And then you will simply click the submit button, which will add this particular funding source to your funding table. Now, the next thing I want to look at is the budget code table. The budget code table is also in your Setup Tables tab. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see your budget codes under the funding section. So we're going to click on this and open up our budget codes. Now, it's very important in order for you to use the budget code table, we need to create your budget code structure for you. And that does involve your implementation specialist or perhaps someone in support to do that. So you will need to contact your implementation specialist or someone in support to set up a structure for you first, and then you can set up your budget code table. It is not a requirement to set up the budget code table for all of the funding sources. Obviously, the fourth option that we just looked at, you do not use the funding or the budget code table for that. But if you are using the first option or the multiple funding, you will need to have your budget code set up first, and then you would set up your funding sources. And again, before you can set up your budget code table, you have to set up the structure. Please contact support or your implementation specialist to do this. All right, so let's talk about how do we set up our budget code table. Let's just take a look at the ones that are already here. in my demo site. Notice that you have a description of this account, and then it's broken down into the structure. And again, this is customizable by the App Garden. You'll need to just let us know what your structure is. If you want to create account codes, budget codes that include the question marks that we've looked at, here you can see the examples. What the question marks mean, again, is that this particular fund, whoever the fund is available to, whatever school they're available to, then that account will populate exactly the same with the exception of the location code, which will be populated where the question marks are. So the question marks are utilized in the first option of your funding sources, and the third option, the multiple funding, is where you'll use those question marks. The example here, this one doesn't have question marks. The federal programs, it's just going to populate this account. And if this account had a location-specific code associated with it, then this would only show for the school that has that code, and if you were using your multiple funding. So, for example, like this Boulder Valley test, this would only be included in the list in the dropdown if 334 is the requesting location. So let's set up an account code or a budget code. We're going to create a new code. Click on the button, and it's going to bring up your structure. The details for the structure include the name of this or the title of it. So the budget code that, whatever it would be referring to or related to. So this is information only, but you would include whatever this is. So maybe this is a basketball fund. And then you will fill in whatever the number of digits are for each particular section. And so the basketball fund might be Fund 2, purpose, the program. And again, these labels, they can be customized, whatever you need them to say. And then the school code, and this is either the question marks or an actual school location that only this applies to. However many digits are in your requesting location or your school codes is how many question marks there need to be here. So if you have 5 digits in your location codes, you would need 5 question marks. 3, you would need 3 question marks, and so on and so forth. And then you'll click submit. So then that will add that particular funding source or account code to your budget code table. Okay. So once you have that set up, then you have all of your budget codes set up, then you can decide how you're going to use them. So let's say, for example, that you would like for your schools to see a list of valid budget codes for their location when they select a funding source called school funded for field trips. And you have 5 budget codes that they can select from that apply to all the schools. Some schools have a special code that just apply to their school, but some codes are the same for everyone except for the location code of the account code. So what you may want to do then is set up all those 5 codes in your budget code table, and instead of putting the actual school number, you put the question marks in, and then when you go to set up your funding source, in your funding source table, you would set it up as option 3. And perhaps you would call it school funds. You would choose the multiple. And so again, we don't have a drop down. We just are any school funds that have that location code they'll see all of those. And so they may see a string of account codes that have their number in it or have question marks in it, and they'll be able to pick that on the request. So just to be clear, budget codes with question marks will apply to any of the requesting locations. Budget codes that have an actual school number in it will only be seen by that particular school. So let's look at another example. Perhaps you would like to have an athletic travel funding source for each school that contains a budget code that that school uses for athletics. The codes vary from school to school, they're not similar, and maybe each school also has an allotment for their athletic travel. So the first step then would be to create that funding source. You don't have to use the budget code table for this. You can if you'd like to, and that budget code can be selected from the table, or you can just key it in. Either way, it doesn't matter when the requester selects that particular funding source. It's going to auto-populate with that particular account code. So in order to set up this athletic fund, we're going to create a new funding source. And maybe we're going to, just use it for one of our locations. Let's maybe it'll be our South Brunswick High School is the only one who can use this. We're going to make it a single budget code that allotments are allowed. And then you can key in whatever that particular funding source may be. The code is not editable. And then if you needed to fill in any of your approver information or anything like that, you could, whether or not to include it on school finance, make that decision. And then you're going to make it location specific by clicking yes. And that will bring up a list of all of your schools. You'll choose the school that has the access to it, that can choose that particular funding source. And then which type of trips, maybe it's only available on athletic trips. And then we're going to want to bring up our allotments section of our funding table here. And here we scroll down and we have our budgeting section where we're going to put in our allotments. Remember, you're going to include the dates that this allotment is allowed and to be utilized, the beginning and ending dates of the allotment, the budgeted amount, and then you would click your submit button, which would set this account up for you with allotments to be used. Let's consider another example. Let's say you would like to have a funding source for the school choir. Each school uses the same code, except that the location part of the account code is different. So this funding source should only show up for field trips. Okay, so the first thing we need to think about is if allotments are going to be used. If you are using allotments, then you're going to need to set up a separate funding source for each location, like we did a few minutes ago. Let's say that we are not using allotments in our example. So the first thing we're going to need to do is set up the account code in the budget code table. So let's go to the Setup Tables tab, click on Budget Codes to open the table, and then we're going to create a code for school choir or school chorus. And then fill in your different sections of your account code. And then the school location code will include question marks. because it's the same account code for all the locations except for that's the only difference. So we'll submit that and set up that school choir as our account code. Now, once we have set up that account code, we're going to go to the funding sources table and set up a funding source using that particular account code. So we'll click on Create a New Funding Source, and maybe we'll call it School Choir. And we're going to select the first option here. It's a single budget code based on the requester's location. And then when we select that code here, then that will be the school choir code, and it will populate on the request form and in the invoice, filling in instead of the question marks, it'll fill in the location code of the requesting location. And then again, you'll go through if you need to add approvers or payment email people. You can make this one location specific if it's only available for certain schools. So maybe this school choir account only applies to maybe the middle schools and the high schools. So you will check off those locations, the middle schools and the high schools. And then again, like we said, it's only going to be available for field trips. So we would make it available just for field trips. And then we're going to submit that one into our funding sources table. So here it is. So now when the request is submitted, the schools that are allowed to use this one will see it in their drop-down. When they pick it, it will populate with the account code, and it will complete the account code with their location code. It may be helpful for you to see the experience of the end user when they're selecting the different funding sources in a trip request form. So let's open up a trip request and let me show you kind of how that will work for them. So let's say this is a field trip. We'll put in our date and time. And let me just get as far as our requesting location and our destination. Okay, and so now we have displayed the funding sources. So this is a field trip. I've picked a high school as the location. So when I click on the funding source, it's going to bring up a list of all the funding sources that are available to my location for field trips. And we can see there's just, multiple funding sources. If we pick something like a PTA, I think is one. This one is just a one-to-one funding source with an account code. Now this one does have an allotment associated with it, so you can see the um, summary information about the balance of that particular funding source. The description here is part of the funding setup. If you need more information. And then there's also an approver that is associated with this one. So this person will be added to the approval flow if this is the funding source that's selected. Now, if we selected the school-funded one for our location, it brings up just an account code. There's no extra approver, nothing. It's just kind of a one-to-one, not an allotment. The district budget codes is the one that is going to bring up multiple account codes. So I have one funding source, and over on the budget code, instead of it auto-populating, it gives me a list of all of the accounts that are available to me due to my location code, which is 334. And so I can see here the school code is 334, and I can pick any of these. And that will be what will show up on the on the invoice. So I can pick any account that has my number in it. Okay. So if I change the account or the requesting location, let's change it to a middle school and see what differences we see here in our options. So the middle school, we still have a lot of options here. We also have the one that I added a moment ago, school choir. And so this is that one that we used the little question marks and we made it a single based on the single location. So we can see my school's code here on this school choir code, and it is even described as being school choir. Now, if I am an elementary school, I shouldn't see school choir because we didn't turn it on for elementary schools. So it's not there. No school choir because it's not available to me as an elementary school. So hopefully seeing some of those examples will help you as you come up with your plan for how you want to set up your funding sources and whether or not you need to use the budget code table, if you want to use allotments, if you have account codes that are similar except for the location code. So lots of flexibility, lots of different options. Now, we will be very happy to help you with the setup of your tables. More than likely, you have had your implementation specialist get you started with your funding, and all you may be doing is just maintaining the table, maybe adding some accounts if necessary. Um, but obviously, we will be more than happy to help you with any questions that you have on your funding sources and helping you get these set up. Thank you so much for your time, and be sure to let us know if we can offer any assistance. Thank you so much.